What happens when the man who spent 3 years telling you that you would never be good enough shows up to the exact night the city decides you are the best there is, and makes it his personal mission to prove the city wrong? Noelle Varga had asked herself some version of that question 17 times in the 45 seconds since Alec Stafford walked through the ballroom doors. She stood near the south end of the bar at the Fairmont Copley Plaza's Grand Ballroom, a glass of sparkling water raised halfway to her lips, watching her ex navigate the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who had never once questioned whether he deserved to be in any room he entered. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her first month's rent in Boston. His jaw was shaved smooth, his hair was freshly cut, and draped over his arm, laughing at something he'd just whispered, was a woman named Kendall, tall, blonde, and slight enough that a strong wind off the harbor would make a conversation of her. Noelle lowered her glass. She had known, statistically, that this was possible. The Boston Architecture Society's annual Elevation Gala was the most important night in the city's design and urban planning calendar, and Alec now worked as a capital advisor for Whitmore Bain, the development firm that had co-sponsored 3 of tonight's award categories. Of course he'd be here. Of course. What she had not planned for was having to process his presence on tonight of all nights, when the crystal plaque on the table at the front of the room had her name engraved in it. Noelle Varga, Senior Design Director, Halstead Partners, recipient of the 2026 Elevation Award for Excellence in Urban Planning and Community Design. 3 years. 3 years of 16-hour days, of arguing with city planners and skeptical partners who kept suggesting she scale back her ambition, of redesigning the Harborview Commons project from the ground up after the original contractor had quietly buried a critical load-bearing miscalculation that would have doomed the structure within a decade. The Commons now sat on Boston's waterfront like something dreamed up by someone who actually loved the city, a public gathering space that merged green infrastructure with accessible design, open to everyone, beloved by everyone. Last fall, Architectural Digest had run 6 pages on it. Tonight was supposed to feel like proof. Instead, Noelle was watching Alec Stafford scan the room until his eyes landed on her, and then, with a smile that hadn't changed one molecule since the night he told her she was too much for any room he planned to be in, he started walking over. Noelle, he said her name like it was an old coat he'd outgrown, but couldn't quite bring himself to donate. I didn't realize Halstead sent a full delegation. Just me, she said. His eyes moved over her, not subtly, not accidentally. They moved the way they always had, that particular traveling assessment she had once told herself was attraction and later understood was inventory. He was cataloguing her, the way he always catalogued anything he had once owned. "You look great," he said. "Bold choice with the color." She was wearing deep burgundy velvet, a gown that wrapped her full hourglass figure like it had been designed with exactly this in mind, because it had. She'd had it made for tonight. She'd known exactly what she wanted to walk into this room wearing. Kendall smiled pleasantly at nothing in particular. "I like bold," Noelle said. She excused herself before he could respond and took her place at the head table. The dinner was 8 courses and the kind of ambient string quartet that kept the noise level just quiet enough for every nearby conversation to be audible if a person wanted to listen. Noelle's table included 3 senior partners from competing firms, 2 city planning commissioners, and, because the universe apparently had a sense of the theatrical, Alec Stafford, who had been seated 2 chairs down on her left when the name cards were rearranged after a last-minute RSVP change. Kendall sat to his right, shoulders bare, picking at a salad of microgreens with the studied concentration of someone who hadn't yet decided whether food was worth the effort. For 40 minutes, it was manageable. The conversation moved through the usual channels: zoning reform, the new Harbor District proposal, a debate about whether Boston was ready for elevated rail. Noelle was articulate and precise and slightly funny at the right moments, and the commissioners kept directing their questions to her, which was deeply satisfying. She had almost forgotten Alec was there. Then the third course arrived. "I have to say," Alec said, to no one and everyone, simultaneously, setting down his wineglass with the careful deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed the gesture, "the Harborview project is impressive, in its way." The table quieted a fraction. "In its way," Noelle repeated. "Well," he smiled, "it's ambitious, scale-wise." He tilted his head with the practiced concern of a man who had learned to package cruelty as candor. "I just always wonder, with projects like this, whether the ambition is coming from the design vision or from a studied pause, a need to take up space." One of the commissioners cleared his throat. No one said anything. "The scale was determined by the community's documented needs," Noelle said very evenly. "We did 18 months of participatory research. Before the first line was drawn, the square footage serves the actual people who use it." "Right, of course." Alec picked up his fork. "I'm just saying, sometimes restraint is its own kind of genius, knowing when not to overreach. Some people have to learn that the hard way." His gaze drifted, deliberately. She was certain of it, from her face to her collarbone to the full curve of her chest beneath the burgundy velvet, and then, with almost theatrical subtlety, back to her face. Others seemed constitutionally incapable of it. The table went completely, mortifyingly silent. Noelle felt the warmth climb her neck. She had spent years, actual years in therapy and in her own head, working piece by piece through the wreckage of the time she'd lost to this man's particular brand of affectionate contempt. She knew what he was doing. She knew it was a performance, calibrated for maximum audience, designed to make her react so he could tell the story later, as though she'd been the unreasonable one. She knew all of that. And her hands were still trembling beneath the tablecloth. "That's not a professional observation, Alec," she said quietly. "That's rude." He laughed, the particular laugh she had hated most, the one that managed to be both dismissive and benevolent at once. "Come on, we dated for 3 years. I think I've earned a little candor. I'm trying to give you useful feedback, not tear you down. But you always took everything personally." He glanced at Kendall with a small, collegial eye roll. "It's an emotional regulation thing, very common in people who," he let the sentence trail, "who struggle with discipline in general." His gaze moved slowly and deliberately to the breadbasket sitting nearest Noelle's hand. "Not that there's any shame in it, I'm just being honest." The implication sat in the air like smoke. One of the planning commissioners had begun studying the tablecloth with exceptional intensity. The senior partner from Whitmore Bain, Alec's own firm, looked visibly ill. No one intervened. Alec was worth too much to this table. In the particular currency these men had decided mattered most. Noelle set down her fork. The prongs clicked against the china, precise and controlled. She was going to stand up. She was going to remove herself from this table with her dignity intact, cry in a bathroom stall for exactly 4 minutes, dry her face, go accept her award, and survive the rest of the night. She had done harder things. She had rebuilt a structural foundation under a building while a corrupt contractor tried to talk her out of it. She could survive one dinner. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs, preparing to push back her chair. A shadow moved at the edge of the table. There was no commotion, no announcement. One moment the space behind Alec's chair was empty, and the next it was occupied by a man who seemed to have materialized there the way a storm front moves in, not with noise, but with pressure. The air around the table changed. Conversations at adjacent tables thinned without anyone seeming to consciously notice why. The string quartet kept playing, but some frequency in the room had been subtly, unmistakably altered. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that didn't come from calm so much as from absolute confidence in being the most consequential force in any space he entered. Dark suit, no tie, a black shirt buttoned to the collar. His features were sharp and distinctly European, and his dark eyes, when they moved with the slow, deliberate efficiency of a man who never spent attention on anything he hadn't already decided was worth it. Those eyes settled on Noelle first. Not on Alec, not on the partners, on her. "Miss Varga," his voice was low, unhurried, carrying just far enough. "Congratulations on the award tonight. The Harborview Commons is one of the most thoughtfully executed public spaces this city has produced in 20 years. The structural innovation alone deserves its own recognition." Noelle blinked. "I thank you. Do I know you?" "Luca Senna." He didn't offer a hand. He didn't need to. His name moved through the table like a current, and she felt it in the way the partners nearest her straightened almost involuntarily. "I've followed your work for some time." "Hey." Alec's voice had an edge she hadn't heard before, not the cultivated arrogance, but something underneath it, a tightness. He turned in his chair, craning upward to look at the man standing behind him. "This is a private event. We're in the middle of something." Luca Senna looked down at him. The look lasted approximately 2 seconds. It contained no particular expression. It was the look a person gave to a fly on a windowsill, not hostile, not interested, simply acknowledging the presence of something that had failed to read the room. "I know what you're in the middle of," Luca said. "That's why I'm here." Alec pushed his chair back slightly, squaring his shoulders with the instinct of a man accustomed to winning arguments through sheer insistence. "I don't know who you think you—" Luca's hand came down on the back of Alec's chair. It was barely a movement at all, but Alec's posture changed completely and instantly, in the way a body changes when it suddenly understands that the rules of a situation have been revised around it without notice. He settled back. His jaw worked once. "The Harborview project," Luca said, addressing the table but watching Alec, required its designer to identify a compressive load error in the foundation schema that the original contractor had deliberately obscured in his filed documentation. The correction she submitted, anonymously without credit, because she cared more about the structural integrity than the recognition, prevented a failure that would have compromised the building within 8 to 12 years. He paused. "Some people might call that kind of thoroughness an overreach. I'd call it the only reason that parcel is worth anything to anyone currently trying to develop the adjacent waterfront properties." The Whitmore Bain partner went very still. Adjacent waterfront properties, Alec's firm's current flagship project. "What doesn't need to speak," Luca continued, "is any further commentary about discipline or restraint from someone who is currently under a fiduciary review." The quality of the silence changed. Alec's face had gone the color of old chalk beneath his tan. "I don't know what you think you know," he said, but his voice had lost its architecture. The words were still there. The confidence had left the building. Luca reached into the interior pocket of his jacket. He withdrew a single folded document, clean white paper, folded in thirds, the kind that comes from a laser printer. He held it between 2 fingers, and the table watched him the way people watch a hand of cards being turned face up, knowing the result will be decisive. He unfolded it with one hand and set it flat on the bread plate in front of Alec. Noelle leaned forward. It was a wire transfer summary, 6 transfers on a single page, originating from the same account, Stafford Capital Advisors. The destination accounts were numbered offshore, and the total across all 6 was not a rounding error. The memo lines on 4 of the 6 contained a client account reference she recognized immediately, the Meredith Shaw Arts Foundation, whose endowment trust Whitmore Bain managed on behalf of the board. Alec stared at the page. In the space of 10 seconds, his face moved through denial, calculation, and collapse in a sequence so rapid it barely registered as human. "Those are internal transfers. They're not what they—" "They're not authorized," said the Whitmore Bain partner flatly. She had leaned across the table to see the document. Her voice had gone cold and precise. "That is a restricted endowment, Alec. No disbursements without a full board resolution. I was going to replace it, It was temporary. I was covering a shortfall in the... I managed the Meredith Shore Endowment through a family trust, Luca said. I have managed it for 9 years. In that time, no one has touched the principal without authorization. Until approximately 11 months ago. He folded his hands. The shortfall you were covering is related to losses from a personal trading account you maintain under a separate entity. I have those records as well, if the table requires them. Kendall had already picked up her evening bag. The Whitmore Bain partner was reaching for her phone. Alec looked around the table, at the partners, the commissioners, the phone being quietly but decisively raised, and then he looked at Noelle. There was something in his face she had never seen there in all the years she'd known him. Genuine, unperformed fear. The sneer was gone. The inventory gaze was gone. What remained was smaller and far less interesting than he had always believed himself to be. I can explain, he said, to no one, to everyone, to the general atmosphere of a room that had already moved on from him. Luca was no longer looking at him. He had moved around the end of the table and was standing beside Noelle's chair. When she looked up at him, the coldness had cleared from his face, not replaced by warmth exactly, but by something quieter, something that looked improbably like care. The air in this room, he said, has become unreasonable. He extended his hand. It was a large, steady hand, and there was a plain gold ring on his right index finger, the kind people wear when they mean something by it. I have a reservation across the street that needs someone willing to let a good meal simply be a good meal. Would you allow me the company? Noelle looked at his hand. Then she looked at Alec, who was quietly disintegrating at his end of the table, every seam of his 3-year architecture of superiority coming apart at once. She thought about the woman she had been when she first met Alec Stafford, 29, freshly promoted, already learning to fold herself into shapes that made men like him more comfortable. She thought about the years she had spent getting quieter, smaller, more decorative. She thought about the night she'd stayed until 4 in the morning, running load calculations on a building she didn't own, filing a report she'd get no credit for, because she physically could not let something structurally compromised go into the world without saying something about it. She placed her hand in Luca Sena's. He helped her to her feet with the ease of someone who had made the calculation before she had, and was simply waiting for her to arrive at the same answer. He did not rush the exit. He walked beside her at a pace that made clear they were not fleeing anything, they were choosing somewhere better to be. As they passed the length of the table, Luca paused once, briefly, and said something very quietly near Alec's ear. Noelle didn't hear the words. She heard only the specific silence that followed, the silence of a man who has run entirely out of moves. The February air outside the Fairmont was clean and sharp and smelled faintly of the harbor 2 blocks west. Luca's car was at the curb, a dark sedan with a driver who held the door without being asked. Inside, the leather was warm and a low, piano-heavy melody came from the speakers, something she didn't recognize but didn't need to. Luca poured 2 glasses of still water from the center console and handed her one without ceremony. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You knew who I was before tonight," Noelle said finally, not a question. "Yes." She turned the glass in her hand. "How long?" He looked out the window as the car moved through the Back Bay streets. 2 years before the Harborview Commons opened, you filed an emergency structural complaint with Boston Inspectional Services regarding load failures in a foundation pour on a commercial property in the Seaport District. He looked at her. That property was mine. The contractor had submitted falsified inspection certifications. The failure you identified would have caused a partial collapse under peak occupancy conditions within 18 months of opening. Noelle stared at him. She remembered that night. She had been reviewing public filings on an adjacent project, routine due diligence, when something in the load distribution figures refused to reconcile. She'd spent 48 hours running the math before she was certain enough to act. She'd filed anonymously because she hadn't wanted to start a war. She'd only wanted to prevent a disaster. "I didn't know it was your building," she said. "I know." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but close to one. "I spent 6 months tracking down who filed that report. I expected a veteran engineer with 3 decades of credentials. Instead, I found a 30-year-old design director at a mid-sized firm who was not being paid anything close to what her judgment was worth." He said it without flattery, the way a person states a fact they verified and found annoying. "I've been watching your career since." The car crossed the bridge over the Charles, and the city lights scattered across the black water in long, unsteady lines. Noelle absorbed what he'd said with the careful attention she gave to anything that didn't immediately resolve. "You could have introduced yourself at any point," she said. "I didn't want to interfere with the work. I wanted to see what it looked like when left alone." He glanced at her. It looked exceptional. The restaurant was a small private room above a narrow street in the South End. No sign on the door. The owner greeting Luca by his first name and Noelle by hers, which meant he'd called ahead. The table had a view of the rooftops and a single candle in a glass, and the menu was handwritten because the kitchen changed it daily based on what had arrived that morning. They talked for 3 hours. Luca Sinner was publicly understood to be a real estate developer whose family trust held property across Boston, Providence, and New York. What moved in the spaces between his sentences was a more complicated picture, one she didn't press him on, and he didn't offer to fully illuminate. Some information travels better in the gaps. What she did learn was that he had spent a decade systematically converting the family's more volatile interests into legitimate ones, a process he described with the same analytical steadiness she used to describe load-bearing calculations. He had a daughter. He had a library. He read structural engineering journals the way other men read the sports page, which she found so strange and particular and oddly moving that she laughed out loud when he mentioned it, and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on a man's face in years, genuine pleasure at having made her laugh. She ordered dessert without consulting the conversation. He didn't comment. He simply flagged the server and waited for her to continue what she'd been saying. She told him about Alec. The real version, not the professional summary, the years of making herself quieter, smaller, less. The night she'd caught the structural error, sitting on the floor of her home office at 2 a.m, with printed plans spread around her in a circle, eating cold takeout directly from the container, absolutely certain she was seeing what she was seeing, and absolutely terrified to say so. Luca listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt. He didn't redirect to himself. When she finished, he asked one question: "What made you file?" She thought about it, because the alternative was knowing I didn't. He nodded slowly, the way someone nods when a thing confirms something they already knew. The news broke before she reached her office the next morning. She was in a car on Tremont Street when the first alert hit her phone. Stafford Capital Advisors, regulatory hold on client accounts. Pending investigation into unauthorized fund disbursements. By the time she walked through Halstead Partners' glass doors, there were 3 messages from the managing partner and 1 from a Globe reporter. The office was unnaturally quiet when she stepped off the elevator. Her colleagues, people who had watched Alec's performance the previous night, with varying degrees of discomfort, and said exactly nothing, were watching her now with the specific expression of people recalibrating their proximity to someone who had suddenly become more dangerous to be against than to be aligned with. Thomas Caldwell, the managing partner, met her before she reached her office. He was a reasonable man who had built a good firm on reasonable instincts and a deep reluctance to make unnecessary enemies, and last night he had studied his bread plate for roughly 4 minutes, while a man publicly inventoried her body in front of him. Noelle. He said her name with the careful warmth of someone making a belated investment. "I want to discuss the partnership track. You should have been made partner a year ago." That was an oversight, and I want to correct it immediately, and I want to talk about giving you full creative lead on the seaport. A failure of judgment, she said pleasantly, not an oversight. He blinked. She looked around the office. At the glass walls, the drafting tables, the award plaque already mounted near reception with a small directional light trained on it. She had built things inside these walls that would outlast everyone currently standing in them. She'd always known that. She had spent a significant portion of her career being quietly grateful for the opportunity to prove it to other people. She was done with that particular arrangement. "I'm going to resign," she said, "effective today. Noelle, the partnership. I appreciate the offer, I mean that." She did, in the limited way she was capable of meaning it right now, "but I don't want a partnership in someone else's firm, I want my own." She collected 3 things from her office: a framed photograph of the Harborview Commons at golden hour, a structural reference text with her handwritten annotations in every margin, and a small rubber cactus a colleague had given her years ago as a joke about her ability to survive without much water. She took the elevator to the lobby. Luca was there. He was leaning against the wall beside the revolving doors in a navy coat, hands in his pockets, with the unhurried air of a man who had been there long enough to be comfortable, but not so long as to be uncertain about being there. When the elevator opened, he pushed off the wall and walked toward her. "You resigned," he said. "How do you know that already?" "Thomas Caldwell and I belong to the same squash club." The corner of his mouth shifted slightly. "He texted me in considerable distress." She laughed despite herself, a real laugh, unprepared. He reached out and took the heavy reference text from under her arm without asking, tucking it against his side like it was the most natural redistribution of weight in the world. "I have a proposition," he said, "and I want to be clear that it is a business proposition and a separate proposition, and you are under no obligation to accept either one, or both, or to accept them in any particular order." That's a very precise disclaimer. "I have lawyers. It becomes a habit." He nodded toward the street. "The family trust owns 11 blocks of commercial and mixed-use property in the Fort Point Channel District, several buildings untouched since the 90s. I've been waiting for the right person to tell me what should be done with them." Noelle looked at him steadily. "Full creative authority," he said. "Structural, interior, public access design, adaptive reuse, sustainability requirements, a budget that will not be the limiting factor. A contract structured around your timeline." He paused. "And an office space if you want one, in a building you'll have designed yourself." She thought about the Harborview Commons. Every square foot of green space fought for, every accessible pathway argued over, every detail that made it genuinely belong to the people who used it. She thought about what it would feel like to do all of that without asking anyone's permission first. "The separate proposition," she said. "What is it?" Luca looked at her for a moment. The morning light came in hard and cold through the building's glass facade, and she could see the lines of his face clearly, not softened, not performed, just direct. "Dinner," he said. "Not a tasting menu with an agenda, just dinner, somewhere you choose." Last night was dinner. Last night was a negotiation with dessert. His eyes held hers without moving. "I'd like to try the version where neither of us is watching the room." Noelle considered him, this complicated, contained, unexpectedly precise man who had spent 2 years watching her work from a respectful distance and had walked into a gala ballroom not to be seen, but to make something stop. She had spent a long time being surrounded by people who looked at her and saw something too large, too much, too unwilling to be managed. She had built the armor required to survive that, and the armor had been effective, and it had also been exhausting. Luca Senna looked at her like she was a load-bearing structure he had spent years trying to understand, and had finally, quietly decided he couldn't do without. "The business proposition," she said. "I'll need a week to prepare a proper scope of work and fee structure." That's reasonable. The other one. She held out her hand for the reference text. He gave it back, and for just a fraction of a second didn't let go, so their fingers overlapped on the spine in a way that was not accidental and not nothing. Tonight. 7 o'clock, and I'm choosing the restaurant. Something moved behind his eyes, not surprise exactly, but the quality of attention that appears on a person's face when something arrives exactly where they hoped it might. That, he said quietly, is more than reasonable. She stepped through the revolving door and into the cold morning, her reference book under her arm, her next project already assembling itself in her head. Not a revision, not a scaled-back compromise, but something built precisely as large as it needed to be, on ground she had chosen. 3 blocks north, in a federal building on Cambridge Street, Alec Stafford sat across a conference table from 2 investigators and a compliance attorney, watching everything he had constructed from borrowed confidence being disassembled with the same careful, methodical precision he had once told her she would never be capable of. He had always underestimated how much can be undone by a woman who simply refuses to stop seeing clearly.